Howdy my totally as always tubular gamers, and we're back with, you guessed it, another ranking video. And today we're talking From Software again. You know, I've talked about Dark Souls, I've talked about the Soulsbornes, but today I want to talk about all of the modern From Software video games. Now, From Software at this point really doesn't need an introduction. Legendary game studio, been around since the 90s and have been producing titles pretty frequently since then, but they really exploded, you know, around Dark Souls, Dark Souls 2, Bloodborne, Sekiro, etc. And so today I thought I would come in and I would rank/review all of From Software's modern games. What are all their games that you can play on a modern console that they've developed? It's more than just the Soulsborne games. There's actually 3 other games that From Software have developed that are on modern consoles, particularly the newly released Armored Core 6 that I'd really like to talk about. So yeah, we're going to rank them all worst to best, see how they all stack up against each other, give them all a little review, what's my favorite, what's my least favorite, which one has great gameplay, which one has a good story, etc, etc. If you've heard me talk about the Soulsborne games, I'm going to just tell you my thoughts haven't exactly changed in the last month or two, but I have timestamps to talk about new games if that's all you're here for. And just to be clear, I consider modern From Software games PS4 and on, including re-releases. Any remasters or re-releases of From Software games, those are very viable here as well. I'm just talking about all the From Software games that can be played on a modern console. You know, I've played all these, I have experience with all these. I don't have experience with every From Software game, at least not yet, and I'm sure somebody down below is going to say I forgot something. Let me know down below how you're feeling. Or if you want me to look at another series or studio or whatever it is you are feeling, just tell me down below. Like, share, subscribe. We got the Patreon going on as well. You know, let's just get right into it. Of the From Software games that are on modern consoles, which do I think is the weakest? And so here we have Deracine, pretty sure that's how you say it, Communication Wizard Pro over here, but anyway, yeah, here we have Deracine releasing for the PS4 in 2018, exclusively on the PSVR. Now, I don't have a ton of experience with this game, but I'm pretty sure most people don't even know that this game exists, let alone is actually developed by From Software, and again, it's exclusive to the PSVR. If you do not have the VR, you are not able to play this game. And I'm going to just say this game is very, very different from all the other games From Software's made. It's one of their more experimental titles, and it's a really unique game, actually. The premise is certainly different. The player takes the role of a fairy in an isolated boarding school who attempts to solve a mystery. And that's all I'm really going to say when it comes to the story. This game is very narrative focused. It is very reliant on its story. It's all about the story and the characters and solving this mystery. The game is really a first-person adventure game, where really it's all about the story and the writing and the characters and solving some puzzles here and there. You know, you teleport around the area, you don't get to walk freely, which is fine with me. And yeah, you really just solve some puzzles. You pick up some items, you put them somewhere else. And you're just taking in the game's story and atmosphere and world like an adventure game. But is it any good? Yeah, I think it's alright. I'm not going to come out here and say that this is my favorite VR game or my favorite walking simulator or adventure game or anything like that, but I think this game is still solid. And if you like What Remains of Edith Finch or Everybody's Gone to the Rapture or even The Vanishing of Ethan Carter, I think you'll like this game. The storytelling is very unique. It is very From Software with that melancholy. And the game certainly has a unique premise, atmosphere, and just world to it. Like, the game is visually actually very good, and the facial features are quite good. The game runs on Unreal Engine rather than From Software's proprietary technology, and it shows. I think the game looks good. And when it comes to my opinion on the story, you know, I think it's alright. It's a very interesting premise, but I wouldn't say that it really gripped me all that much like some of the other walking simulators I just mentioned. And when it comes to the actual gameplay, again, it's there, it's nothing too special. I feel like they don't use the really interesting abilities as much as they should, and the puzzle variety, you know, from the little bit I did play this game, it didn't seem the most varied. But I still liked it. I'm not going to come out here and say this is a bad game or one that's worth skipping, but you know, it is a little limited on who can play this game. Obviously, it is still only on PlayStation. It's only on the PlayStation VR as well. I think the game could probably do a lot better if it was released on computer. I feel like this sort of game is more geared towards PC. I mean, this kind of experience is geared towards PC. I mean, PC and adventure games have always been hand in hand, and so that's why I think that, but you know, if you have a PSVR, yeah, I think it's worth trying. There's a lot worse PSVR games. I'd rather play this than like the Batman VR game. And if you like From Software, then, you know, that's another bonus, especially if you like how they do their world building and storytelling. I think you'll really enjoy this more than the average person. In fact, the reason I think I even really enjoyed this story all that much to begin with is because I like the other From Software games, but this game is still decent. And here we have a game I've wanted to talk about forever. Here we have Metal Wolf Chaos, specifically the re-release from 2019 on PS4, Xbox One, and PC. Now, the original Metal Wolf Chaos did come out in 2004 on the original Xbox. It was also exclusive to Japan, but it had a huge cult following to the point where Devolver Digital, of all publishers, was able to actually not only secure a deal with From Software, but get the game re-released. And so while this game might not be as modern, air quotes, as some of the other From Software games I'm talking about today, it is widely available on all modern consoles outside of Nintendo. But what the hell even is this game? Why did it even take off? It had no business taking off. It was some tiny Xbox exclusive only in Japan. Well, there's a reason it took off. See, the game is just completely insane when it comes to its story, premise, characters, voice acting, gameplay, really just everything. It's totally insane, and the fact that this exists is just amazing. So the game takes place in the far future, and it sees the United States plunged into a state of civil and economic unrest. The military launches a coup d'etat led by Vice President Richard Hawke and succeeds in gaining control of the nation's government institutions. During this time, Michael Wilson, a fictional relative of Woodrow Wilson, is serving as the 47th President of the United States. Yes, really. Wilson realizes he is the country's last hope of freedom, and he dons a giant mech developed in secret by the military to fight Hawke and the rebel forces. That might have been a long-winded explanation, but this is all to say basically the president is fighting the vice president in a giant mech, and yes, trying to save America and save freedom. It's certainly a really good 4th of July game, I will say that. The story of this game is just completely, it's just nuts. It's bonkers, it's goofy as hell, and it's stupid as fuck. But the game absolutely knows that, and it takes it in stride with some of the funniest cutscenes I've ever seen.
Richard! Chasing 15 million feet after me. Now that's love. Well, I love you too, Michael. Richard!
Like, the voice acting in this game is just legendarily stupid, and I find myself quoting it probably on a weekly basis just because it's just so funny.
Richard! 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 Michael! Richard!
I have nothing but the highest praise for the story and the characters and the writing and the voice acting. When it comes to the gameplay, this game, it plays a bit like From Software's older mech games. It is a third-person shooter where you are in this giant lumbering mech with a large arsenal of weapons, and you gotta fight your way through destructible environments full of enemy infantry, tanks, helicopters, you name it. Basically everyone and their mom is trying to stop you. The goal of each mission really is just to destroy all the enemies. That's every mission in this game, is you're dropped into an environment, a rather linear environment, and you just destroy everything. It's just pure, dumb, chaotic fun. You know, sometimes there's some side objectives like collecting energy pods or rescuing hostages, and saving hostages even gives you some bonuses like some musical tracks or special weapons, but yeah, you're really just destroying everything. And this game, it's actually a pretty solid third-person shooter. It does take a little bit of time to get used to, especially because it is a mech game, but yeah, it's actually quite solid. The game has over 100 unique weapons, so there's plenty of weapons to blow shit up. There's handguns, machine guns, surface-to-air missiles, but only 8 can be equipped at a time. Weapons are unlocked with money collected from each stage, and destroying enemies in quick succession actually gives you these like chain bonuses, and you get more points, more money, etc., more weapons, more ways to blow shit up. Like this game, it's just a dumb, fun third-person shooter. It is not a strategic game. It's not exactly thought-provoking, but it is engaging and it is fun. I remember I got this day one when it got re-released, and I pretty much played through the whole game in one sitting because I was just having so much fun. I was like, man, this game is fucking awesome. I'm so glad that it's finally available to play in America officially. With this technically being a re-release, there are a few little bonuses. You know, there's widescreen support, the resolution is much better, the game looks quite a bit better with improved textures and visual effects, and it's just a lot smoother, and of course they preserved all the voice acting. Look, this game's not going to win any awards for its gameplay, and certainly not for its story or characters, and the gameplay, it isn't the most challenging or engaging, but it's still a fun time, and the music actually really slaps in this game. I love the music of Metal Wolf Chaos. It's really good, and it's underrated, and this game, yeah, I'd say it's a bit underrated. It's a cult classic for a reason. And I think that if you like third-person shooters, you like mech games, or you think the game is just funny as hell due to how stupid it is, then it's totally worth playing. It's not even expensive either. Like, just go check it out if you've laughed at any of these cutscenes, seriously.
A nice day, or not, Michael.
And so here we have Demon Souls. Now, it was originally developed by From Software and released on the PS3, however, it was remade for the PS5, with that version being developed by Bluepoint Games, and it was a PS5 launch title that I got. Now let's just get this straight immediately. Demon Souls is a pretty good game. However, when you compare Demon Souls to Dark Souls, to Bloodborne, to Sekiro, to Elden Ring, to all of the From Software games, I personally think that it is the weakest, but out of everything I just mentioned, it was also the first, and so I think it's a great sign that yes, Demon Souls might be the weakest of all of these games, but that just means that the series has only gotten better and better from that initial game. And there's a bunch of aspects where you can tell Demon Souls was their first attempt at this kind of game. Well, minus Kingsfield. But anyway, Demon Souls takes place in this kingdom known as Bolteria, and it sees it being consumed by darkness from this creature known as the Old One, and so players take on the role of a hero brought to Bolteria to pacify said Old One. The story isn't exactly the deepest, even compared to like the other Dark Souls games. It's pretty straightforward and there isn't a ton of lore here to learn about the world, or I just missed it all. Now I'm going to just talk about the presentation right off the bat because it is like the first thing you see. The PS5 version of Demon Souls is one of the greatest looking video games like of all time. It is not even close. 2-3 years later from when the PS5 came out, it still looks amazing and it's one of the best looking titles on the console. The original game was really rough and crusty looking. This PS5 version just looks phenomenal. All the enemies look great, the environments look amazing, the frame rate is super smooth and solid. Like, it is just a fantastic, gorgeous looking game, and it's the best looking game on this list. The soundtrack is also really great. A lot of the time, you know, there's not much music. It's pretty ambient, but when it kicks in, oh, it's good stuff. Sound effects also great, and I love how it comes through the controller speaker. I've always liked that for the PS5 version. Anyway, let's actually talk about the game. So the game is an action RPG, and it sees the player navigating through 5 different worlds from a hub called the Nexus. Now, there are 5 different worlds, but there are a couple levels per world, and all of these levels are incredibly linear. Really, there's only one way to go through them. It is kind of cool, though, that after you beat the first level of the game, you do go back to the Nexus, and you can actually go to any of the 5 worlds, really in any order you want. You're going to have better luck at certain ones than other ones, because some of them are hard as fuck. But it is still cool nonetheless. The game is very linear with its structure. All you have to do is just beat all of the levels and you will be done with the game, simple as that. The game's progression is also quite straightforward. There isn't a bunch of open-ended level design, there's no looping, there's occasional shortcuts, but for the most part it is very straightforward, very linear. Go here and fight the boss. But of course, what are you doing in these levels? Well, you'll be fighting a lot of enemies. That's really what you're doing a majority of the time, is fighting these enemies or exploring around. Now, the combat and just the controls in Demon Souls is a lot slower and a lot clunkier than Dark Souls ever was. And after playing Sekiro and Dark Souls and now Elden Ring and coming back to Demon Souls, it took me quite a bit of time to get used to the game. It is a lot slower, actually, than all of the games I just mentioned, and it is a bit stiffer. This game is like a one-to-one remake with its controls, how slow it is, and the combat, so it's pretty impressive in that sense, but it also lets you see really how far the company has come from this original game. The combat is still satisfying. There is still quite a bit of depth to it. You know, you can swing your sword, you can two-hand your sword, you can use a shield, you can parry, you can roll. And all of these actions use your stamina bar. You can't just wail away infinitely on an enemy. Your stamina is going to run out. The stamina bar comes back decently fast, but if you're not prepared and your stamina is hella low, you're just going to get fucked up. You can use magic and cast a variety of spells, and the way magic is in this game is a little different from the other games, and magic actually is really good in Demon Souls. You are able to equip your player with weapons, armor, spells, staffs, etc. However, depending on what you equip your character with and their weight load will affect how well you roll. You know, if you're heavy as shit, your rolls suck. But if you are super light, you're able to do quick, fast rolls where you have a lot of frames of invincibility. It's a really big risk versus reward system, and a lot of it comes down to, well, how good are you at dodging everything? Something worth noting that totally threw me off as someone who played Dark Souls first is that this game actually has inventory limits. You can't just hold everything, you actually can max out and you have to drop stuff off in a box, which was just really strange. So all of this really comes together to form the combat side of this game, but when you're not in combat, you're exploring these areas. There is some nooks and crannies, and there are some areas to explore. You can find items, new weapons, equipment, and shortcuts to help you out, and help is what you're going to need with this one, because this game is not messing around. You know, it doesn't matter if it's the late 2000s or 2020 or now, this game is still hard as fuck. Demon Souls quickly established a reputation for just being incredibly difficult and challenging, and this game absolutely is that. It is not messing around, and it is no problem kicking your shit in and laughing at you. Most enemies really hit like trucks and can take out a ton of your life bar. Most of the bosses will either one-shot you or nearly one-shot you. Health items are rather limited, and a lot of the encounters really just are challenging. Some of the enemies can be tricky to predict and read. Some of the environments they put you in just do you absolutely no favors, like when you're on the side of a cliff. The way Souls works can be pretty punishing. Everything that you're holding at that moment can be lost if you die, and then if you die again, it's gone. Poof, you just spent an hour grinding but you didn't bank all the XP, it is gone like that. And a few of the bosses are so gimmick heavy that if you don't perfectly understand the gimmick, you just will not win. The game is very difficult, but it is not impossible, and it is absolutely beatable. I've beat the game, I won't lie, I'm not great at video games. I've never said I was all that great at games, but I've been able to beat Demon Souls. And if I beat it, you can too. And I won't lie, there was a couple moments where it felt like I was banging my head against the wall, just trying over and over and over. Or there were times where I just lost a shit ton of souls because I wasn't able to get back to my bloodstain. And you know what? Shit happens, but you persevere, you try again, you get back up, and that's how you beat Demon Souls. Okay, let's get away from the difficulty for a second. There are actually a number of good things about this game outside of the presentation. There's a number of good levels. Yes, they are all very linear for the most part, but I actually did enjoy a number of levels in this game, particularly some of the early ones. However, I won't lie to you, there are some levels that are just fucking terrible in this game. The swamp, all of the swamp levels are bad. The prison, the first level, the prison can fuck right off with these Cthulhu looking motherfuckers. I hate these motherfuckers. I hated them. Like, Jesus, man. Fuck these guys. Thinking about them just pisses me off, and seeing the footage, honestly, it just brings my piss back to a boil because I hated them so much. Anyway, so some of the levels, though, are actually good, and they're different from other Dark Souls-like levels. And I think the level design in a few of these areas is actually pretty decent, and I like when they loop around. Now, the bosses in this game, I won't lie to you, they're a bit of a mixed bag. Some of them I think are actually really good. There's a lot of really great iconic boss fights in this game that are really fun and challenging. However, there's just too many gimmick or spectacle fights, as some people call them, where there really just isn't much of a fight. You usually just do like one or two things, and that's kind of it. And the spectacle fights, I just didn't really care for these much, because I'm like, no, I actually want to fight that. I don't want to do what the game tells me to do. I just didn't really care much for that. And then some of the gimmick fights, like once you figure out the gimmick, like the blind man, like it becomes a cakewalk. It's super easy. Or the guy who summons someone from online, if he doesn't summon another player, this is just dummy easy. Speaking of online, there is some online capability. The PS5 version goes on, and I can tell you from experience, there are people still playing this game online who have no problem invading your game and killing you. But, you know, if you're able to defeat them, you do get a decent reward. You can also summon them for help, but I actually have never tried summoning in Demon Souls. And so all of this, the difficulty, the combat, the experience, the Cthulhu motherfuckers, all of this comes together to create a pretty good action RPG. If you've played all the Dark Souls and Elden Ring and Bloodborne and all of that, and you come back to Demon Souls, it's going to take a bit of time to get used to. It's going to take a while. However, if you stick with it, I think you have a very rewarding experience that is absolutely worth playing nowadays. Would I recommend this game to newcomers of the series? No, I would not. And that's mostly due to just how crushing it is, especially if this is your first time playing one of these games. Like, your max health goes down by half when you die in this game, unless you have a ring equipped. Like, it is not messing around. But I still enjoyed my time with Demon Souls. There's a lot of good here. It's not as long as the other Souls games, taking me around 25 hours, but I could definitely beat it much faster a second time through. Alright, we've talked long enough about Demon Souls. At least I've explained all the mechanics of the Souls games, so I won't talk about the other games as long. But yeah, Demon Souls, pretty good game still. And here we have Armored Core 6, which is not only the latest title by From Software, but it's the latest in the Armored Core series, the long-running mech series. And it's pretty great to see that after like 10 years of no Armored Core, it comes back and it's better than ever. Like, they really looked at the original Armored Cores and what people liked and brought it into a new age and really modernized it. And I think that From Software has really created one of the most fun action games of 2023. Is this going to be, the most thought-provoking, difficult, engaging game that From Software has made? No, it is not that. But what it is a really fun time, where you just get in this big ass mech with these giant guns, lasers, cannons, swords, you name it. There are a ton of weapons and you're just blowing shit up in this game. This game, it does have the old Armored Core structure where there's just a ton of missions. They just give you a ton of different missions to do, and every single one, it's basically the same. Go blow something up. Sometimes you're investigating something or checking an area out or defending something, but in the end, you're really just blowing everything up. And you'll encounter plenty of resistance, whether it's like tanks, airships, other mechs. Everyone and their mom, it seems, wants to stop you from doing whatever it is you're doing. And yeah, you're just gonna have to stop that. You're gonna have to blow them all up, and that's pretty much the entire game. The game does have a story, a premise, plot, and even a few characters, but this game, it's a lot more subdued than most games. It's actually very similar to Dark Souls in that it's more in the background. There's a lot of world building, and it's not front and center right in your face. And I think it's decent enough. The world is decently interesting. I do wish that there was a little bit more to it, but what I think is here is fine enough. I get, though, it's probably not going to be for everybody, and some people might want a more engaging, in-your-face story, but what we have is fine enough. They give you more than enough reason to give even a little shit about what you're doing and blowing everyone up. And then really you just go mission to mission. It's very linear in that sense, and these missions, are incredibly linear. There's not some big open world to explore. Like, you really are given an objective marker, just go here, fight everything. When you're not in the missions, there is the arena where you can just take on a bunch of other mechs depending on your rank, and then of course there's customizing your AC. Now, customization is really a big aspect of this game, a huge selling point to the game. Really, like, low-key, the focus of the game is making the greatest AC that fits your playstyle. Like, there are so many weapons, so many attachments, so many bodies, and there's a bunch of factors like weight, speed, damage output, etc. It's actually really cool, and the most fun I had with this game was just experimenting and seeing what worked for me. What got me the best results? Was it 2 Gatling guns in the wheelchair gaming? Is that the best way to go? For me, that was fun, but it wasn't my best way. I really did love just having a big ass melee weapon and a Gatling gun, and then just usually giant lasers or missiles on my back. Like, the game is a ton of fun, and it's just a blast to figure out what your favorite weapons are, because some of the weapons in this game go absolutely nuts. It's not the most balanced, I won't lie to you, and some builds are clearly better than others and work with basically every scenario, but man, figuring out what works best for you is some of the most fun I've had in 2023. And then the moment-to-moment gameplay is incredibly satisfying. Controlling the AC is incredibly satisfying. It feels really great to control. You're this big lumbering mech, but you can actually still do a ton of different quick maneuvers. You can move around really fast depending on your mech, or you'll have a bunch of health, and then you've got all your weapons. The gunplay is incredibly satisfying. The explosions look great. Like, they really nailed down the mech combat. I think it's superb. There is the tiniest bit of strategy, with your booster and of course ammunition, but really the point of the game is to figure out which weapons work best for you and which allows you to blow everything up the fastest. And once you find that, man, so much fun. I've said that a few times now, but that's really what this game sets out to be. Just fun. And the game does have some challenge to it. A few bosses did actually challenge me. The one that challenges everybody, the filter, it challenged me as well, but just playing around with all the mech parts, you'll figure out how to beat each boss easily in no time. Like, you just gotta experiment a little, and that's a really fun time. The game is just incredibly customizable. It's incredibly giving. Like, if you buy a weapon and you don't like it, you can sell it back for the exact same amount of money. The game is not ball-crushingly hard. It, again, is very forgiving. The game does have some replayability with extra missions, New Game Plus and New Game Plus Plus, and different endings. The game's got quite a bit of content to it. If you like Dark Souls or if you like From Software, I think the game is worth trying. It is very different from what they've made if you've only played that from them, but I still think it's enjoyable. If you've never played Armored Core, I think this is a great entry point to the series, and maybe it'll make you check out the old ones. It certainly will make me check out the old ones, but yeah, nothing but high praise for this one. This game, ton of fun. And so here we have Dark Souls 2, specifically the Scholar of the First Sin Edition. Now, I got Dark Souls 2 when it came out. It was actually the first Dark Souls game I ever played through. And when the re-release came out on the newer consoles, I played through that as well and enjoyed that version more than that original release. Now, Dark Souls 2, I know over the years, a number of people have been talking shit about it, saying it's the weakest of the Souls games, it's not by Miyazaki, it's not worth playing, and I'm here to tell you that as someone who's played through the game twice and all the DLC, I do think Dark Souls 2 is worth playing. Is it as good as some of the other Souls games? No, it's not. Does it have a number of issues with it? Yes, it does. Is it still a good to great game? Yes, it is. And is it still worth playing? Yes, I think it is still worth playing. So, Dark Souls 2 begins with a human who has become undead, cursed to never die and doomed to eventually become a hollow, a zombie-like being with no memories or purpose. And so the protagonist is known as the bearer of the curse. And really, you want to break this curse, and the undead travels to the fallen kingdom of Drangalek, and is tasked with finding these 4 great souls from powerful old ones. Now, I think the world and the setting of Dark Souls 2 is still decently interesting. There's a decent amount of lore here. It's not as interesting as, say, the first games, but I quite like it still. And I think Dark Souls 2 is a pretty decent aesthetic here. I think the game graphically looks good, especially the Scholar version, and it looks a bit better than the first game. It does have some janky moments to it, and sometimes the animation can be a bit rough, but generally speaking, yeah, I think it looks quite good, and there's some really nice looking environments in this game. Don't really have any complaints with the presentation or the music or the aesthetic or the world or anything like that. Now, when it comes to the gameplay, it does play very similar to the first Dark Souls. An action RPG where you're tasked with getting a couple items to progress, and along the way you're going to fight a bunch of tough enemies, tough bosses, and go through some really perilous environments. Combat is relatively similar to the first games. There's a bunch of weapons you can use spells, you can dodge, you can block, you can parry. However, I will say there are some key differences here. Parrying and backstabbing is not as good as it was in the first game. It is a little different. You can now power stance, which is pretty cool, and weapons degrade way faster than they did in the first game. Unlike the first game, you can fast travel immediately, and to level up you will have to go back to this really nice hub and talk to this lady to level up. Level design is a lot more linear than the first game as well. There are some roundabouts and some shortcuts, and there is a fair amount of backtracking in this game, but for the most part it is a lot more linear than the first game ever was. I wouldn't say it's as linear as Demon Souls. It's literally not level 1, 2, 3, but it is quite straightforward, especially compared to the first Dark Souls where it was a lot more open, there was a lot more non-linearity. Here, it's a bit more straightforward. The game still has the same systems in regards to its multiplayer and its souls. The multiplayer, it's still the PvP, you can still summon people for help. Dark Souls 2 actually is a pretty healthy PvP community, at least it did even just like a year ago. When it comes to the soul stuff, yeah, you already know the drill. You know, if you die, you can go get your souls back, and if you don't, they're gone forever. It's just as punishing as it's always been. Now, speaking of the difficulty, I think Dark Souls 2 actually has a pretty good balance with the difficulty. I don't think it's stupid hard. I don't think it gets as crazy difficult as, say, Dark Souls 1 does, but it's also not the easiest either. I think it is a good balance. Well, outside of the DLC. The DLC in this game is not messing around. It is actually very difficult. And obviously, you know, Dark Souls 2, compared to, you know, most video games on the market, yeah, it's going to be really hard. But it's very much beatable. I mean, even somehow I beat it twice. Now, there are a number of things that I do like about Dark Souls 2. I do like a lot of the areas. I do like the aesthetic. I do like power stancing. And there are some really cool boss fights here. However, there are some things that I have some issues with. I don't like the adaptability stat, which basically is how invincible you are when you're rolling. It's now a stat, which I just don't think is the right way to go about it, and I don't think any of the other Souls games have anything like this. Now, there are a number of cool bosses here. There are some where I'd say, yeah, these are some of the better bosses in the whole series. In fact, the DLC has plenty of great bosses, like the Fume Knight, but a couple of these bosses, in fact, a lot of these bosses just suck. A lot of them are just really unexciting, where you just fight like a dude. A lot of them are just not all that engrossing, they're not super challenging, and there's just not a ton going on. There's not a ton of mechanics, and you just can usually just wipe them out a lot of the time. And I didn't think many of them were memorable, or if they were, it was for the wrong reasons, like that giant dragon towards the end of the game. This is like the worst boss in like Dark Souls history. This thing's just awful, but a lot of the bosses I don't think are anywhere near as good as some of the series' best. And the same could be said for the levels. You know, every Dark Souls has an area that kind of sucks, but the gutter in Dark Souls 2 is just awful. Like, this place is just awful, and I hated the gutter. I hated the gutter every time I've even thought of the gutter. Like, it's called the gutter. Of course it's gonna be shit. And it is. Also, the Covenant's just not as good as the first game. They were just kind of forgettable, and they existed, and that's about it. But there's some good areas in this game also. There's some memorable areas, there's some memorable fights, and like I've said a few times, the DLC is actually really solid. I'd say the DLC is low-key the best part of this whole game. Now, I'm sure plenty of people have very long videos why they don't like Dark Souls 2 and go way more in depth than I'm going to go in this video. This video is already going to be long enough as it is. Dark Souls 2 with the DLC is like the longest of all the Dark Souls games, taking well over 40 or 50 hours to beat, but it's a really rewarding, great experience in my opinion. There are some lows for sure, and the boss fights are kind of lackluster, but there's plenty of good here, and there's a number of reasons why so many people still do like the game. I have no problem recommending the game if you've tried any of the Dark Souls games, and I think this game's actually a really good entry point. It's also widely available, so go check it out. And here we have Dark Souls 3 releasing in 2016. I was very excited for Dark Souls 3 and was there day one, and a number of years later now, I still think Dark Souls 3 is pretty solid. Now, Dark Souls 3 has a number of callbacks, throwbacks, whatever you want to call them, to Dark Souls 1. It sees you playing as the Ashen One, an undead who failed to become a Lord of Cinder, who rises up and must link the fire by returning Prince Lothric and the defiant Lords of Cinder to their thrones in the Firelink Shrine. I think the story is solid enough. I mean, there's a lot of lore here. There's actually quite a bit of lore in Dark Souls 3, and they really do kind of create this world that I really do like, especially if you actually sit down and read a bunch of the lore here. It's really quite cool. Now, Dark Souls 3 feels like it takes elements from Dark Souls 2, but it feels more like Dark Souls 1 infused with Bloodborne, which came out in between 2 and 3. For instance, the game is a lot more fast-paced, particularly when it comes to the combat. It feels much faster compared to Dark Souls 2, and it feels more like Bloodborne. You can pull off a bunch of attacks with quick succession, actually. Another thing that feels like it's been carried over from Bloodborne is how a bunch of weapons have special moves attached to them. These, as they're called, skills, are special abilities that vary from weapon to weapon and use these focus points, which is a new bar that you have. So you have your Estus Flask, you know, how you get your HP back, which is limited and finite, and it replenishes at all the bonfires, but there's also one for the focus. You will have to sacrifice an HP Estus Flask for a Focus Estus Flask slot though, so, you know, it's a risk versus reward to even use the focus attacks all that much. I never really used them all that much, but I know some of the weapons have some really cool focus attacks. You can also charge attack your weapons, which is from Bloodborne. Magic also returns in a big way. It's more like Demon Souls actually, with FP being back, and magic, yeah, magic's very viable here. The combat, in my opinion, is the best of the 3 Dark Souls games. It's faster, it's smoother, it's more satisfying, there's a lot of risk versus reward, and it's just really engaging. I really did like the combat of this game, and there's a lot of depth also. The game has a number of RPG systems in here as well, you know, the usuals, your equipment, your weapon, and your stats. The adaptability stat is gone. They now have the luck stat instead, which has actually stayed throughout, which is cool. And it certainly feels like you have more options in how you want to build your character in Dark Souls 3 versus, say, Dark Souls 2. When it comes to the levels, it's also more like the first game. Yes, you can still fast travel from the beginning, and yes, it is a bit more linear than the first Dark Souls, where it was this big, kind of open-ended world you could explore. It is more linear. However, these levels are actually pretty vast, and there's a lot of detail, encouraging some exploration. It's not as straightforward as the second game was. And there's some really awesome levels and areas you'll traverse through in this game. I think the level design is actually really good and a decent step up from the second game. I really did like a lot of the areas here. Are there some stinkers? Of course there's some stinkers. There's a swamp. That's stinky. But aside from the swamp, I do think a majority of the game actually is good levels. The same could be said for the enemies and the bosses. You know, the enemies in Dark Souls 3, it's going to take some time to get used to some of them, and some of them are going to wipe the floor with you, but I think the encounters against the enemies are all actually pretty solid, and I like that a lot of the enemies will actually change up their tactics, sometimes mid-fight. The same can go for the bosses. The bosses are a huge improvement over the second game. There are some really standout bosses here, and a lot of them actually put up a good challenge. I like that a lot of them change the fight up midway through. In fact, most of them actually do, and some of the bosses towards the end of the game actually get really challenging. I would say Dark Souls 3 is some of the coolest bosses of the entire series, and the balance between good and bad bosses leans much heavier on the good versus, you know, Dark Souls 2 where it didn't. So Dark Souls 3 seems like a pretty great game. Why isn't it your favorite Dark Souls game? I mean, it's the best looking of the Dark Souls games. Yes, absolutely. The game actually looks quite good. It's a decent improvement on 2. The frame rate's great. The animation's solid. I think the music's also really cool. Okay, graphics aside, why isn't it your favorite? You know, this might be a bit of a hot take, but when I played through Dark Souls 3 the first time and, you know, subsequent playthroughs, I've really felt this feeling of retread. You know, this was the third Dark Souls game and it feels like they kind of retread a bunch of Dark Souls 1 and 2, and it didn't feel as memorable or iconic when it comes to some of the fights in the areas as say the first one did, or even a few parts of the second one. It felt like there was a lot of callbacks to Dark Souls 1, like, ooh, you remember that? Ooh, yeah, you like that from Dark Souls 1? Here it is again. And like, it's cool, you know, there's like a throwback, but it didn't evoke the same emotions. It didn't give me the same level of awesome experience, and I just didn't find Dark Souls 3 as memorable as the first game. It just made me think about Dark Souls 1 and how unforgettable it was and how amazing that first playthrough was of it, and it made me want to go back to Dark Souls 1 rather than continuing to play through Dark Souls 3. Maybe it's just a testament to how good I find Dark Souls 1, but Dark Souls 3, I feel like it could have used a little bit more new stuff in it rather than throwing back to the first and second Dark Souls so much. The DLC does remedy this a little bit, but I've actually never finished all of the DLCs, so maybe I'm not the best judge of this. Also, the PvP, even though I'm not a big PvP guy, I could tell right off the bat it just wasn't as good as, say, Dark Souls 2. When it comes to the difficulty, I think Dark Souls 3 is actually the easiest of the 3 Dark Souls games. It's the easiest to get into, and I just didn't find it anywhere near as challenging as the other ones, so maybe that's a negative for some people, but it's just worth noting. Now, Dark Souls 3, I still really enjoyed my time with it, and I still really liked it. It has a great number of things going for it, like its awesome world, some of the level design, some of the bosses, some of the secret bosses are really great. The combat is the best of the 4 Souls games easily, and I like the faster paced nature of this. Is it my favorite of the Dark Souls games, though? No, it's not. It is very close, though. But I really have absolutely no problem recommending this game to anybody who hasn't tried a Souls game that wants to get into them, or if you're a fan of the other Souls games, then yeah, I think it is worth playing. And so here we have Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, releasing in 2019. I was there day one, was really excited for this one. Part of me was a little sad it was not a new Tenchu game, but after playing through this game, yeah, that doesn't matter. This game absolutely whoops some ass. So this game is a bit different from the Soulsborne, Souls-like games that From Software's known for. Like, this game is much more of just a straight action game rather than an action RPG. There's really one way to play the game, and there's not much when it comes to RPG elements. The story and setup and really just plot are also totally different from like the other Souls-like games. The game takes place in the Sengoku era, and it's about this shinobi named Wolf, and it's about him protecting the divine heir, this kid named Kuro, and that's all I'm really going to say about the story. It starts out really interesting, and it does have a few interesting twists and turns, but I didn't think it was amazing. This might be one of my famous hot takes, but I think the story is just alright. I think Wolf is a pretty decent protagonist. I think the initial setup is good, and I think the world is actually fleshed out and interesting. It's just the actual plot itself and where it goes, and by the end of it, yeah, it was just alright for me. I didn't like love it. I wasn't head over heels. I wasn't fascinated. I wasn't super into it. I was just like, yeah, this is alright. The story was not necessarily the aspect that really kept me going with this game. It was the gameplay more than anything else, because this game just goes so hard. And so, like I mentioned, this game, it's much more of a straightforward action game. There's really only one way to go about the game, and that is with your sword. You know, all those different weapons and techniques you could do in the Souls games, none of that really is here. It is all about you and your sword and countering and blocking and jumping and doing stealth kills. But for the most part, it's pretty straightforward, just hack and slash combat. The combat still feels decently similar to, say, Dark Souls or Bloodborne, but it's significantly, and I mean significantly faster, tougher, and relies a lot more on your reflexes, more so than those games ever did. Like, you'll be doing, you know, your basic sword strikes, but there's a bunch of techniques you can learn throughout the game, and then just blocking and being able to counter enemies and parry them is incredibly important here. Like, you have to become really raw at this game if you want to get anywhere. Additionally, unlike Dark Souls or Bloodborne, you can jump and you get a grappling hook, so you can just swing all over, you can jump all over the place, you can jump off enemies, you can jump off cliffs if you want. I mean, you could just jump really anywhere in this game. You can even wall jump. Stealth also plays a huge role in this game, sneaking up on enemies and just getting a stealth kill or taking out a ton of their life with stealth. It's usually preferred. Some areas really encourage you to be stealthy, and the stealth mechanics are actually pretty decent here, especially for being not a stealth game, or at least primarily not a stealth-based game. I mean, stealth is just an option. It's not the only option. I think the stealth is actually pretty alright here. I think it's well implemented, and it's very clear when the enemy can and cannot see you, and it's incredibly satisfying to get those stealth kills. In fact, the combat is just stupidly satisfying in this game. If I had to describe this game in one word, it would be satisfying. Like, the combat is incredibly satisfying on just about every level. When you start the game, you know, you're kind of just getting used to it, doing some sword strikes here and there, maybe a stealth kill here and there, but by the end of it, you are flying around like a crazy man, just stealth killing everything, killing everyone incredibly fast with some super awesome skill, and parrying people left and right. Nobody's going to get a hit in on you, and if you don't play that well, you're just not going to beat this game, because I'll be real, out of all the games that From Software has made, this very well might be the hardest one of them all. There's no summons, and the game forces you to play a certain way. You either have to get good or you're not going to get anywhere. There's no cheese strategy here, there's no shields here. You really have to just be incredibly aggressive, and some of these boss fights are some of the toughest boss fights I've ever faced in any video game, taking me a long ass time to beat, like the final boss taking me well over 2 or 3 hours to beat, but man, when I finally beat it, it was incredibly satisfying. And while talking about the boss fights, they are nothing short of spectacular. Not only are they just a visual treat, but they're all very different from each other. I wouldn't say there's a bad boss fight here. They're all challenging, they're all engaging, they all have their own strategies, and while there might be more fights in, say, a Dark Souls game than this one, it's definitely quality over quantity, because almost all of these bosses are incredibly memorable. Like, these are some of the greatest bosses in any video game. They're just excellent. Oh, and did I mention, I think I might have mentioned it, that they'll kick your shit in. They will absolutely kick your shit in and will not hesitate to do it over and over again. I mean, even just the regular enemies can totally kick your shit in. Like, obviously every Souls-like game can do that, but this game just has no problem wiping the floor with you, especially if you don't get good at parrying. Like, the game's just gonna kick your ass, the end. When it comes to the level design, it's not trying to kick your ass as much as some other Souls games. There's not like a ton of traps here like the other Souls games. It's very linear, actually, and rather straightforward. There's obviously a lot of platforming here and a lot of grappling around, but I think it's actually well done, and I think the levels, yeah, they're well designed, they're interesting, they keep me engaged throughout, and they place enemies in a way that doesn't feel cheap. I actually think the enemy placement was very good here. The level design was just solid in general. Same for the presentation. Game looks pretty good, ran super smooth, never had any issues there. The sound is pretty awesome. The music that plays during some of these boss fights is epic, to say the least. It was just good all around. And so with all that, I'm sure you might be asking, well, why isn't it like the top game? Why isn't this your like favorite of all of these? Well, I'm not huge on the story, like I mentioned, and I've never been the biggest fan of like, hey, you have to play through the game this one way with the sword, otherwise you're not going to get anywhere. I've always liked the variety and customization that I would get in the Souls-like games, and I know this game isn't trying to be like that, but I mean, there's enough similarities here that I think I can say that. I would have liked a little bit more customization, maybe with your weapon, or some more RPG elements, because getting the skills and all of that is super basic in this game, and you'll get like all the skills by the end of the game anyway. But at this point, it's pretty clear what I'm doing. I'm nitpicking. These issues are very small and very minor. It's just that all of these games are fantastic, and so I have to find some reason why I have one lower than the other. I have no reason to not recommend Sekiro with the highest regard. It is not for everybody. It will kick your ass, and it is very hard, but it is so damn good. But my favorite of the Dark Souls games has to be the original Dark Souls. Now, this is going to be corny as shit, I know, but that first playthrough I did of Dark Souls 1, it was like a magical experience. I loved the original Dark Souls. When I beat it, what was the first thing I did? I went and played it again, and then I got the remastered and played through that again. Like, I love the original Dark Souls. I played it a couple years after it came out, after hearing so many good things about it despite how hard it was, and after playing through it, yeah, it's not even close, it's awesome. You know, Demon Souls might have really laid the groundwork for, like, From Software's next couple games, but Dark Souls really is what established it, what cemented it, and made it just fantastic. The game takes place in the kingdom of Lordran, where players assume the role of a cursed undead character who begins a pilgrimage to discover the fate of their kind. Now, the story of Dark Souls 1 I've always thought was incredibly fascinating, and the world of Dark Souls 1 is just, it's just superb. The lore's actually really good, especially if you read it, if you find as much of it as you can. It's interesting. The ending's actually good. The implications are good. I actually really like the atmosphere and the story and the world of Dark Souls. That atmosphere is amazing. None of the other Souls games have captured the atmosphere that the first Dark Souls has. Like, it's just so good. The other games have good atmospheres, don't get me wrong, especially like Dark Souls 3, but Dark Souls 1, the atmosphere is unmatched. This game is just able to invoke emotions into me that like none of the other Souls games have been able to invoke. Like when you go to Firelink and that music starts playing, like it just hits different. You know what I'm saying? Like it really just hits different, and none of the other games have been able to do that for me. And when it comes to this game's presentation, you know, when it came out, it wasn't amazing. It looked alright, but it didn't look great. The frame rate was kind of bad also. The PC port was just unspeakably bad, but since then, it's gotten a lot better. It looks a bit better, and the PC port is fine now. And Games for Windows Live is the fuck out of there. I mean, look, the game doesn't look amazing. Even for when it came out, it looked okay, but I mean, it's passable, and it really does have a nice art style to it. The music is also my favorite of any of the Souls games. Like, I just love the music in Dark Souls 1. It's so epic. It's so good. Like, this shit's gold. But enough about all that. This is a video game. You do play the video game, right? What about the gameplay? So Dark Souls 1, you know, it looked at Demon Souls and said, how do we improve this? How do we make this more engaging? And they found a number of ways to do so. When it comes to the combat, it is very similar to Demon Souls. It's a bit faster, it's less clunky. Your weapon still does bounce off hella shit, but it is less clunky. There's a lot more weapons to use here, and there's a lot more options. You'll get into these fights with these enemies where they will quickly kick your ass, but you can also kick their ass. There's a number of different maneuvers you can do, magic returns, you can swing your weapon, you can roll, you can dodge, you can parry. You can do a number of things, and there's a bunch of enemies. There's actually a really good variety of enemies here, and when you're not fighting the enemies, you're exploring these locations. Dark Souls 1, in my opinion, has the best exploration of the Dark Souls series. The game is a lot more open-ended. Really, it's this big, grand world that you're exploring that's all interconnected. It's actually really crazy how interconnected this game is. And it's something Elden Ring would really expand on. Like, this game is super interconnected. All the areas connect to each other outside of a select few. And you don't even have fast travel for the first half of the game. You get it like halfway through the game, and you don't need it. Like, you really can go from area to area, and it's this seamless experience that I really like. Sure, there's, you know, a bunch of elevators involved and shit, but it really is a seamless experience from one area to the next, and you explore this open world. You're just trying to figure out where to go next, and the game isn't super clear where you're going to go next. It just kind of leaves it up to you, which I always really liked. It really does encourage that exploration. And along the way, you know, you're going to find a bunch of items, a bunch of equipment, a bunch of enemies, some shortcuts, some paths, and I really enjoyed the exploration. It just felt, again, like magical. It was so cool just exploring this world, seeing what it has to offer, finding all the nooks and crannies, the secrets, getting the little pieces of lore. Like, there really just has not been another experience like this, at least in the Dark Souls series. The other ones, you know, you've had the fast travel, they're a bit more linear. This one, it really just felt like a big, grand adventure. And the game wasn't messing around either. This game kicked my ass for hours upon hours, but I just wanted to get back up and try again. There was so much cool shit to it. The game has no problem just wiping the floor with you. Many parts of the game are incredibly challenging and just borderline overly punishing. Areas like Blighttown, the swamps, they can just fuck right off. They suck. But for every swamps, there's like 10 amazing areas with really solid level design, some really interesting mechanics, and it's just really memorable. I have no exaggeration, played through thousands of games at this point, but I'm able to recall plenty of shit from Dark Souls 1, way more than 2 and 3, thanks to just how iconic and memorable they were. Like, a lot of the areas are just so great, and the same can be said for the bosses. You know, almost all of the bosses are like fantastic. They're some of the best bosses in the whole franchise. Like, I love the bosses of Dark Souls 1. There's so many iconic, memorable, challenging and engrossing fights. Honestly, I've seen people rank all the bosses from Dark Souls, and those lists are the ones you'll find me watching, because I'm just like, oh well, how do you rank them? They're all so good. Like, I love the bosses of the first game, the music that plays and how challenging they are and their strategies. Oh, I really like the bosses of the first game. I like the combat too. Don't get me wrong, the combat is not as good as like Bloodborne or Dark Souls 3 or even Elden Ring or any of those. It is not as good, but it is fine. It is serviceable. It's better than Demon Souls. It's a bit faster than Demon Souls, and you can get used to it relatively quickly. But I won't lie, it's got some clunkiness, it's got some jank. Some of the areas where you fight enemies are really challenging, like when you're on like these really high up balconies or you're just like on these little platforms. It does get hard as shit and it can get tough as nails, but I think it's incredibly rewarding. It's so rewarding in this game. Rewarding is really one of the keywords I'd say for Dark Souls. It's just incredibly rewarding when you beat that tough enemy, when you beat the boss, when you finish the area, when you find a covenant, which all the covenants kick ass in this game. I love the covenants. When you find the DLC area, which is super hard to find, but the DLC area also whoops some ass. Like, rewarding is one of the keywords here, because it's just one of the most rewarding experiences I've ever played. And like I said, when I beat the game for the first time, the first thing I wanted to do was go back and play it again because of how good it was. Like, this really is one of my favorite games of all time. It also had a pretty solid multiplayer, considering where it came from. The multiplayer is pretty good in the original Dark Souls. Don't know how many people are playing it nowadays, but there was some good multiplayer. But if it's gone, I mean, you're really not missing a bunch, because the main game is just so good, especially with the DLC. I really recommend everybody try this game. Don't get me wrong, it's not for everybody. It is hard. It is really hard, and it can be very punishing at the beginning, but it really just is one of the most unforgettable experiences I've ever had with a video game, and it's one of the reasons I love video games so much. Like Dark Souls 1, it just hits so different, and maybe it's just my nostalgia talking at this point. Maybe I just have this clouded memory of it, but I really do think the game absolutely holds up and is still just fan-freaking-tastic. It's one of my favorite games ever. And here we have Bloodborne releasing for the PS4 in 2015. Now, I did not play this one when it came out. I played it many years later, and man, I really was missing out with this one. So Bloodborne has a totally different setup and premise and world than the other Dark Souls games. It takes place in Yharnam, a decrepit Gothic city known for its medical advances around the practice of blood ministration. The city's also being totally ravaged by a plague, so the game sees you playing as a hunter, and as the name implies, you have to hunt. You have to hunt the beasts raging through Yharnam and stop that plague. The storytelling, plot, world, themes, all of that, it is amazing actually in Bloodborne. It's incredibly unique and just so interesting. Like, this world has so much lore, and it's so different from all the other worlds that From Software has made. And then the way the game continues with its plot all the way up until the very end, it had me very intrigued, and it kept me guessing throughout. Like, the world building in this game is just so good. It's really like the best aspect of the entire plot or story or premise or any of that. Just the world building. It's really well done. It's really different from everything you've come to expect, and it was one of my favorite parts of this game, along with the aesthetic. Really not just the aesthetic, but the aesthetic and the atmosphere. Like, the aesthetic, not only does it look very visually distinct from the other Souls games, but it looks very visually distinct from like every game outside of maybe Liza P, which is clearly inspired by this. But the atmosphere in this game, it really is second to none. It's like, holy shit, not only is it dark and depressing and gothic and just different from like every other game I've played, but it just hits different. Like, the Bloodborne atmosphere, it's one of the best I've ever seen in a game. It really is just fantastic. This game just has some mad vibes going on with it that no other From Software game has been able to capture. Like, it's just really great when it comes to the atmosphere, and I can really appreciate it. And it's helped by a pretty decent to good presentation. I mean, for 2015, I thought this actually looked really good. And the music, oh, the music is just so good. Like, it is so good. Like, even just the first boss theme is really good, let alone, you know, the later bosses. Like, no, the music is great. So when it comes to playing through the game, it is very similar to the other Souls-like games. You know, the moment-to-moment gameplay isn't crazy different. You explore this world and take on a bunch of enemies. Eventually, you take on a boss, and, you know, you collect souls to level up. If you die, you got to go get them all back, etc. The combat might feel familiar at first to people who've played Dark Souls, but this game is quite a bit faster and more aggressive than Dark Souls. Like, not only is the speed of the combat just faster, But the game is much more aggressive, really incentivizing that risk versus reward gameplay. There's no blocking in the game, so you'll be just dodging everything, and when you get attacked, you can actually attack the enemy back to get some of your health back. So when you get hit, do you want to attack the enemy again and risk getting hit again to get some of that health back, or you just want to back up and take the L? The weapons function pretty differently from the Dark Souls games as well. Rather than there being, dozens of weapons, this game has under 20, but every weapon has 2 forms. So every weapon is basically 2 weapons, and you also get guns, which is something only Bloodborne has, so enjoy it. And all these little tweaks and additions make Bloodborne's combat feel different still from the other Souls games. It doesn't just feel like another Souls game, it really does feel different, and it feels excellent. The combat is just really fast paced, it's aggressive, and will absolutely keep you on your toes, and the game will make you greedy. You'll want to get your health back when you get hit, and you'll end up just getting totally fucked by it sometimes, but oftentimes you'll be able to get that health back, and it just feels really rewarding, especially with the boss fights. When it comes to the enemies and those boss fights, they are totally different from everything you've seen in other Souls-like games. It's, again, very gothic, and it matches the atmosphere and aesthetic, but it just feels different fighting these guys. They also just feel a lot more aggressive than other Souls enemies. It really just matches that whole theme of just being aggressive. And when it comes to the bosses, I'd say some of them aren't the best, I won't lie to you, but other ones, oh, they're so good. There are so many fantastic boss fights in this game, and plenty of them gave me a really good challenge. I mean, while we're talking challenge, yeah, the game is hard. No shit, the game is actually quite challenging. A lot of people have said this is one of the hardest Souls games. Well, I don't know about that. It is still very hard. Something that makes the game immediately more challenging is how healing works. There's no Estus flask here with infinite charges and you just gotta reload the charge. You actually have to use these blood vials, which are a finite item. You can't actually run out and then you can't heal, and you'll have to go grind some or buy some. And I've heard plenty of stories of people running out towards the end of the game and having to go back to the starting area to go grind some. I didn't do that. I just kind of grinded a little bit in the beginning because I was prepared for it, and that's what I'd recommend to everyone else. Additionally, there are some optional elements to the game to help you out. There are covenants. I didn't really mess around much with the covenants, but they return here. There's multiplayer, which I couldn't find anybody, unfortunately, but there is multiplayer. And there's also these new chalice dungeons, which are specialized dungeons that you can access with an item. I really didn't mess around with these much. I was like, they're alright. But what I did fuck with was this level design and how the world is created. Like, this game, it actually harkens back to Dark Souls 1 with this giant open interconnected world where everything really is connected. Like, you can go from the beginning of the game all the way to the end in one go outside of the dreams. I think the level design is arguably the best level design of any of From Software's games. Every area is incredibly intricate with a bunch of different paths. It all connects back, and yeah, it has that adventure feeling that Dark Souls 1 had that I really wanted to come back. Like Dark Souls 2 and 3, they didn't have that in my opinion, but Bloodborne, oh, it has that adventure feeling where you go on just this long epic journey through this big interconnected world, and I loved it. I love the level design here. Sure, I might have gotten lost once or twice, but I really did think the level design was just superb, and it really added to the atmosphere and just the hopelessness and the darkness and just how depressing the entire world was. Like, it was just so engrossing. Like, I felt so engaged the entire time I was playing this, like, thanks to the level design, thanks to the atmosphere and the world design and the lore and how aggressive the combat was. Like, this is just a mean place. Then add on top of that the awesome DLC, The Old Hunters. Like, no, this game, it is a no-brainer to recommend. It is still only on PS4. I know plenty of people are hoping it comes to PC one day. I can tell you, at my time at PlayStation, I never heard once of this game coming to PC, so take that as you will, but I don't know if it's ever going to come to PC. I know plenty of people are also like, oh, this game runs at 30 FPS. I don't want to play a game like this at 30 FPS. It's really not a big deal. It really is not a big deal. You get used to it very quickly, and yes, 60 FPS will be cool or whatever, but it really doesn't matter. It doesn't hold this game back. It's not a real detriment. This is still a great game that I have no problem saying, like, everybody should check out. Unless you really don't like games that challenge you or Souls-likes, then maybe this won't be the one for you. But everyone else, oh yeah, if you can play this game, you absolutely should, because it's just a great game. Like, I wanted to play through the whole game in like one sitting. When I finally played, I was like, how did I miss this? How did I take so long to play this? Like, it is just fantastic. I'm sure I'll be replaying this game more than once in the future just because of how good it was, and you should play it too if you haven't already. And here we have, of course, Elden Ring, not only from Software's best game, but one of the greatest video games just ever made. Yeah, I know I'm tardy to the party at this point, but what is there even left to say about Elden Ring at this point in time that hasn't already been said? It really is not only one of the greatest games ever made, but it's one of the best experiences I've ever had with a piece of media. If I could experience a game all over again for the first time, there's a very good chance that Elden Ring would be one of the games I choose, because that first playthrough I had of this game was just magical. Like, no other word for it, as corny as it sounds, it was just magical. The game sees you creating a character who then begins their quest to repair the Elden Ring and become the new Elden Lord, and you know the plot, it isn't the most in your face. And many times it's rather subdued, but the world building, the lore, the characters, the story, it's some of the best you'll find in video games. It's so fleshed out. There is so much to this world. There's so much to explore. There's so many nooks and crannies. And you know what, while talking about the world, yes, this is open world Dark Souls to an extent. It's Dark Souls of the Wild, as some people have called it, but it is so much more than that. Yes, it is one of the biggest open worlds I've ever seen in a game, but it's also one of the most realized open worlds I've ever seen. Just because it's massive does not mean it's empty or there's nothing in it or stuff is just randomly placed about. Not at all in this game. This game absolutely still has the care and attention given to it that From Software has given to all their other games, despite how big it is. This world is incredibly realized. Like, seriously, you can go to any part of this world and you'll be rewarded with it. There'll be enemies, there'll be some piece of lore, there'll be an item. Like, the game very much encourages you to just go in a direction and stick to it. You can explore most of this world right off the bat. You want to go to one of the last areas in the game and go get destroyed, go ahead. The game will absolutely let you. You can just explore to your heart's content. There's always going to be enemies. There's always going to be something going on, and you'll always be rewarded. And I just had so much fun exploring this giant world. Like, it was just unforgettable. It really was unforgettable here. And then, you know, you're on your horse and you can jump, double jump even with it. They brought jumping in from Sekiro, and I think this is a great addition. When it comes to the combat, yeah, it's not too different from Dark Souls. There are some changes here and there. There are dozens upon dozens of weapons that all play pretty differently from each other. There's many different play styles in this game. Like, magic is actually hella raw in this game. This is the best magic has ever been in any From Software game. Magic rules here. The combat, again, very customizable. There's so many ways you can go about it. There's so many different play styles. There's crafting here. You can actually craft a bunch of items that are helpful. There's tons of useful items in this game. There's summoning, and this is more than just summoning your friend or a little NPC. There's actually a ton of summons you get in this game. You can summon a bunch of different shit, and I'm not going to be one of those who's going to gatekeep you and tell you, don't summon, beat everything on your own. No, no, no. The game clearly wants you to summon. They give you dozens of summons. Summon as much as you want. There's some really cool ones here that can come help you. Like, the summons were incredibly cool. There's just so many different ways to go about the combat in this game. There's dozens, if not over 100 different types of enemies. There's like so many bosses. There's more bosses in this game than any of the other Souls games. Like, most modern games have, like, you know, 10, maybe like 15 bosses in a game. This game is fucking like 60, 70. It is nuts how many bosses there are in this game. So many of them are just really well designed. Not only visually, but they all put up a challenge. Some of them a little bit less than others, but most of them put up a challenge. There's a lot of different bosses here. Yeah, there are some repeats, especially in these smaller little dungeon areas, but there's a lot of different bosses here. They all require different strategies. Yeah, the bosses are spectacular. The fights and the combat and the RPG elements and the open world design, it's all spectacular. There's a bunch of side quests. There's a bunch to explore. You'll easily spend over 70, 80 hours in this game. If you want to do everything, you want to fight all the bosses, you're looking at 100+ hours. It's just crazy big, and there's a shit ton to it. Is it as replayable as, say, Dark Souls or Bloodborne? No, I don't think it is as replayable since it is so massive, and I don't see myself replaying it anytime soon, but god damn, that experience was just so good. Like, there is so much to this game. It's really easy to miss a lot, and I could see people playing through the game 3-4 times and it being pretty different. Different weapons, different quests you're doing, different order to the areas you're doing, fighting certain bosses, not fighting other ones. Like, it's very customizable in that sense. The game is easily the most accessible of any of the Souls-like games. Like, I'm not saying it's the easiest, but I'm just saying it's the most accessible, easiest to get into. I will certainly say it's the easiest to get into. Like, if a certain boss is really kicking your ass in this game, like the first boss, then just leave. You can go do other stuff. You're not railroaded like certain other Souls games where it's like, if you don't beat this boss, you're not going anywhere in the game. In Elden Ring, come back later. Come back when you've explored a bunch more. You can come back and you'll probably wipe the floor with it. The would-be bonfires are not only a lot closer, but they're just better placed. They're placed right in front of the boss door. You don't got to run 5 minutes to the boss if you lose, and you can fast travel to all of them immediately. The game is really good at scaling up. It starts you out pretty small with the areas you explore and the enemies you fight, but as you continue through the game, like, not only does it obviously get more challenging, but everything you fight starts getting bigger. The areas start getting bigger. I think the way the game progresses is just incredibly well done. In fact, the progression as a whole is just fantastic, not from only an RPG standpoint, but just as you play through the game. I would argue visually the game gets better and better as well. Like, it looks amazing. It looks great. There are so many detailed, great looking environments. The character models are solid. The animation's great. The frame rate, super smooth for the most part. I played on PS5, so I don't know about the optimization or how well it is on the computer, but PS5, totally great. I don't really have any issues there. Look, Demon's Souls on PS5, yeah, it does look better than Elden Ring. Demon's Souls is also way smaller than this game, and is just not as complex as Elden Ring is in so many aspects. And so yeah, while it might visually be better, Elden Ring in my opinion has a better art direction and is just a much better video game, period. I really feel like I could talk about Elden Ring forever, honestly. There's so much to talk about with Elden Ring, whether it's the bosses, the world, the atmosphere, the story, the art style, the customization, etc, etc, etc. I know plenty of people on YouTube have talked about Elden Ring for hours and hours, and I'm not going to be one of those people. I'm going to just call it here. If you haven't played Elden Ring, I don't know what you're waiting for. I think every person who can breathe should try Elden Ring. I wouldn't be surprised if people say it's the best game of the decade. It was my favorite game of 2022, and I literally worked on and was in the credits for God of War Ragnarok, and I still thought Elden Ring was better. So what does that tell you? Maybe that I just don't take my work serious enough, but yeah, Elden Ring is absolutely fantastic. And yeah, that's it from this video. You know, it wasn't too different from the Soulsborne video, especially with the order, but I did add the new action games, which ended up all being at the bottom. But yeah, that's really it for this video. If you want to see me talk more from software in the future, let me know down below. Like, share, sub, comment if you made it to this part of the video, comment, cement. Thank you so much. Have a good one. Bye-bye.